They say that trust is the foundation of every loving family, but sometimes the people closest to us can harbor the darkest secrets. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and for 8 years I believed that opening my home and heart to my daughter-in-law was creating the loving, multi-generational family I had always dreamed of. I was devastatingly wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have something even more shocking to share about family betrayal and the strength it takes to rebuild. The moment I discovered the true nature of my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law wasn't when they started making excuses for missing our weekly dinners, or when they began suggesting I might be more comfortable in a retirement community. It was when I heard my daughter-in-law Victoria whisper into her phone at 11:30 p.m., thinking I was fast asleep. "Just keep pretending to care until the will reading, then we'll finally be free of this burden." Those words, captured by the baby monitor I had insisted on keeping in my bedroom after my recent fall, shattered everything I thought I knew about the family I had sacrificed everything to support. After countless nights spent babysitting my granddaughter while they went on romantic getaways, after draining my life savings to help them purchase their dream home in the prestigious Willowbrook Heights neighborhood, after quietly funding their lifestyle for years while living on crackers and soup to make ends meet, I was nothing more than a burden they were pretending to tolerate. But that overheard conversation was just the beginning. What I discovered in the days that followed about their elaborate scheme to manipulate me out of my inheritance, their plans for my future, and the shocking lengths they had gone to isolate me from other family members would change everything. Not just for them, but especially for me. I never imagined my life would take such a dramatic turn at 74 years old. After losing my beloved husband William 3 years ago, I thought my remaining years would be spent peacefully in our family home in Rosemere Valley, surrounded by the love of my only son David and his family. Instead, I found myself questioning every conversation, every gesture of kindness, every "I love you, Grandma Eleanor" from my precious granddaughter Lily. My journey began in this charming Victorian house on Maple Ridge Drive, where William and I raised David with all the love and opportunities we could provide. William was a respected high school principal, and I taught piano lessons from our front parlor for 35 years. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were comfortable, and more importantly, we were happy. When David graduated from college and started his career in real estate, William and I were bursting with pride. Our son was ambitious, charming, and seemed to have inherited his father's natural leadership abilities. We watched with joy as he climbed the ranks at Pinnacle Properties, eventually becoming one of their top agents. Then David met Victoria Ashford at a charity gala in the city. She was stunning, tall, blonde, with the kind of polished sophistication that came from growing up in the affluent Seaside Hills area. Her family owned several boutique hotels along the coast, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never wanted for anything. From our first meeting, I tried so hard to welcome Victoria into our family. I reorganized our holiday traditions to accommodate her preferences, learned to cook the organic, gluten-free meals she favored, and even redecorated our guest room in the modern minimalist style she admired. When they announced their engagement, I was genuinely thrilled, despite the nagging feeling that Victoria seemed more interested in discussing David's, quote, future inheritance potential than in getting to know me as a person. The wedding was magnificent, held at the exclusive Grandview Manor with 200 guests, most of whom I didn't recognize. Victoria's parents spared no expense, and it felt somewhat out of place among their circle of wealthy friends and business associates. But seeing David's happiness made every awkward conversation and sideways glance worth it. After William's sudden passing from a heart attack, David and Victoria were incredibly supportive, or so I thought. They insisted I shouldn't be alone in our big house and began spending more time with me, especially after baby Lily was born. Victoria seemed to transform into the loving daughter-in-law I had always hoped for, bringing me flowers, asking about my day, even suggesting we take a cooking class together. "Mom Eleanor," she would say, using the affectionate name that always warmed my heart. "You're such an amazing grandmother. Lily is so lucky to have you in her life." When they approached me about helping with the down payment for their house in Willowbrook Heights, I didn't hesitate. They explained that David's commission structure had changed at work, and they were just short of qualifying for their dream home in the neighborhood where they wanted to raise Lily. The house was perfect for a growing family: 4 bedrooms, a playroom for Lily, and a beautiful garden where she could play safely. "It's not a gift, Mom," David assured me as we sat around my kitchen table reviewing the paperwork. "It's a loan. We'll pay you back with interest once the market improves, and I get that promotion." I liquidated $75,000 from my retirement account that day, money William and I had carefully saved for my later years. But what was money compared to my family's happiness? What was my financial security compared to providing my granddaughter with the stable, loving home environment she deserved? That $75,000 was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, there would be requests for help with Victoria's failed boutique business, David's investment opportunities that never materialized, emergency repairs to their house, and countless smaller amounts for everything from Lily's private preschool tuition to their anniversary trip to Europe. Each time, they presented these requests with such genuine gratitude and detailed explanations about temporary setbacks that I never questioned their motives. Victoria would often tear up when thanking me, telling me how blessed they felt to have such a generous mother and grandmother in their lives. "You're literally saving our family," she would say, squeezing my hands with what seemed like genuine emotion. "We'll never forget this kindness." I believed every word. I believed in the family dinners where Victoria hung on my every story about David's childhood. I believed in the shopping trips where she asked my advice about everything from Lily's clothes to their home decorating. I believed in the late-night phone calls when she would confide her fears about motherhood and ask for my wisdom. Most of all, I believed in the loving looks they exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching, the way David would protectively put his arm around Victoria when she seemed stressed, and how they both lit up when Lily would run to me shouting, "Grandma Eleanor," with pure, innocent joy. But that night, as I lay in my bedroom listening to Victoria's true feelings through the baby monitor, I realized that everything I had believed about our family was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. The loving daughter-in-law who brought me flowers was the same woman plotting to have me declared incompetent. The son who called me his rock was actively planning my removal from the home his father and I had built together. The baby monitor, installed after my fall down the stairs 6 months earlier, had captured more than just Victoria's late-night phone call. As I would soon discover, it had been recording conversations that would expose the true depth of their deception and the shocking extent of their plans for my future. What happened next would test everything I thought I knew about love, family, and my own strength. But it would also teach me that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to face an ugly truth and the determination to fight for the dignity you deserve. The woman who went to sleep that night believing she was a cherished mother and grandmother would wake up as someone entirely different, someone who was finally ready to stop being a victim and start being a survivor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My story begins in the picturesque town of Rosemere Valley, nestled between rolling hills and historic oak trees that have stood for over a century. This is the kind of place where neighbors still wave from their front porches, where the local bakery knows your usual order, and where 3 generations of families often share the same street. It was here that William and I built our life together, and where I naively believed I would spend my remaining years surrounded by the warmth of family tradition. Our Victorian home on Maple Ridge Drive had been our pride and joy for 42 years. William and I purchased it as newlyweds in 1981, when the paint was peeling and the garden was overgrown. but we could see its potential. Room by room, season by season, we transformed it into something magical. The wraparound porch, where we spent summer evenings watching David learn to ride his bicycle. The kitchen where I taught countless piano students, and where the smell of my famous apple cinnamon bread drew neighbors from blocks away. The master bedroom where we whispered our dreams and fears through 4 decades of marriage. William Hartwell was the kind of man they don't make anymore. Steady, principled, and endlessly patient. As principal of Rosemere Valley High School for 28 years, he touched thousands of lives, turning struggling students into confident graduates and mediating family crises with the wisdom of someone who truly understood human nature. Teachers still stop me at the grocery store to share stories about how William supported them through difficult times or celebrated their successes as if they were his own children. "Your husband saved my career," Martha Jensen from the English department told me just last month. When I was ready to quit after that terrible parent conference, William sat with me for 2 hours, helped me see my worth, and gave me the confidence to keep going. I taught for 15 more years because of him. As for me, I found my calling in music education. Our front parlor became Eleanor's piano studio, where I taught lessons Tuesday through Saturday for 35 years. Children would arrive nervous and leave humming melodies, their faces bright with the joy of discovery. I specialized in working with shy students, the ones other teachers found challenging, helping them find their voice through music. My proudest achievement wasn't the students who went on to conservatories, though there were several, but the ones who discovered confidence at my piano bench and carried it into every other area of their lives. David was our miracle baby, born after 5 years of trying and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages. From the moment he arrived, red-faced and perfect, he became the center of our universe. Unlike some only children who become spoiled or demanding, David seemed to understand intuitively how precious he was to us and carried that knowledge with grace. He was the kind of child who thanked us for bedtime stories, who helped elderly Mrs. Patterson next door with her groceries without being asked, who brought home stray cats and convinced us they needed rescuing. "That boy has an old soul," our pastor used to say, watching David help serve meals at the church soup kitchen when he was barely tall enough to reach the serving counter. "He understands kindness in a way that's rare for someone his age." Throughout his childhood, David excelled at everything he attempted. Straight A's came naturally to him, but more importantly, so did empathy and leadership. He was student council president, captain of the debate team, and somehow still found time to volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend. Teachers adored him, classmates respected him, and William and I watched his development with the kind of quiet pride that comes from knowing you've raised a genuinely good human being. When David left for college at Northwestern University, the house felt impossibly quiet. William and I had to rediscover who we were as a couple without the constant activity of raising a child, but we were proud. Our son was studying business with plans to return to Rosemere Valley and contribute to the community that had shaped him. "I want to help families find their perfect homes," he told us during one of our weekly phone calls, "the way you and Dad found ours. I want to be part of people's happy endings." After graduation, David joined Pinnacle Properties, the most respected real estate agency in our area. He started as an assistant, but quickly proved himself through his genuine care for clients and his intuitive understanding of what makes a house a home. His colleagues appreciated his integrity, his clients trusted his advice, and his sales numbers reflected his natural talent for matching people with their dreams. David doesn't just sell houses. His mentor Frank Morrison used to say, "He creates futures. He listens to what families really need, not just what they think they want." Our weekly family dinners became the highlight of my week. Every Sunday at 6 p.m., David would arrive with stories from work, updates about his goals, and endless questions about our lives. He was genuinely interested in my piano students, remembered details about William's school board meetings, and always insisted on helping with dishes despite our protests. "This is my favorite part of the week," he would say, settling into the same chair he'd occupied since childhood. "This house, this table, these conversations, they remind me what actually matters." When David met Victoria at the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala in 2018, we knew immediately that something significant had shifted in his world. He'd dated several lovely women over the years, but none had inspired the dreamy smile that appeared whenever her name came up in conversation. "She's different, Mom," he confided during one of our Sunday dinners. "Victoria sees the world in ways I never considered. She's sophisticated, ambitious, and she makes me want to be better than I am." Victoria Ashford came from what people in Rosemere Valley would call old money. Her family's hotel empire, Seaside Luxury Properties, had been featured in travel magazines and business journals for decades. Growing up in the exclusive Seaside Hills community, she'd attended private schools, spent summers in European capitals, and moved through life with the effortless confidence that comes from never questioning whether you belong. When David first brought her to meet us, I was immediately struck by her poise and beauty. Victoria possessed the kind of elegant presence that made every room feel more sophisticated simply by her entering it. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her clothes impeccably tailored, and her smile radiated warmth that seemed genuine and inviting. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, embracing me with what felt like sincere affection, "David has told me so much about you. He says you're the wisest woman he's ever known, and that your apple cinnamon bread is legendary in this town." I was charmed by her interest in our family traditions, her thoughtful questions about my piano teaching, and the way she listened intently when William shared stories about his years in education. She seemed fascinated by our modest lifestyle, asking about everything from my grandmother's china collection to the history of our neighborhood. "There's something so authentic about the life you've built here," she told me as we toured our garden together. "In my world, everything feels so planned, so performed. This house has real soul." During their courtship, Victoria began joining our Sunday dinners regularly. She would arrive with flowers from the expensive florist downtown, compliment my cooking with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm, and engage in conversations about books, current events, and family memories with remarkable grace. When she offered to help with meal preparation, she approached even simple tasks with the focus of someone determined to learn our ways. "I want to understand what shaped David into the incredible man he is," she explained one evening as she helped me roll out pie crust. "This kitchen, these traditions, the love you've poured into this family, it's beautiful." The engagement announcement came during Christmas dinner 2018, and William and I couldn't have been happier. David was radiant with joy, Victoria seemed genuinely excited about joining our family, and their plans for a life together sounded like a perfect blend of ambition and traditional values. "I know we come from different backgrounds," Victoria said, taking my hands as we cleared the dinner table, "but I want you to know that what you've created here, this warmth and love and acceptance, that's exactly what I want for my own children someday." Our quiet life in Rosemere Valley had always been built on simple pleasures and genuine connections. William and I had never needed grand gestures or expensive entertainment to feel fulfilled. Our wealth was measured in relationships, in the students whose lives we'd touched, in the community we'd helped nurture, and in the family we'd raised with love and intention. Looking back now, I realize how naive we were about the very different world Victoria came from, where relationships often carried price tags and love was sometimes confused with leverage. But in those early days, all I could see was my son's happiness and the possibility of the extended family I'd always dreamed of having. The woman who welcomed Victoria into our Sunday dinners, who spent hours teaching her family recipes, who opened her heart without reservation to this sophisticated stranger, had no idea that she was actually inviting a predator into the sanctuary she and William had spent a lifetime creating. But that innocent woman was about to face challenges that would test everything she believed about family, trust, and her own ability to protect the legacy she and William had built together. The first crack in our perfect family portrait appeared on a Tuesday morning in March 2021, though I wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. William had been experiencing what we thought were minor heart palpitations for several weeks. Nothing dramatic, just occasional fluttering that he dismissed as stress from budget negotiations at the school district. He was only 68, active and healthy, with annual checkups that consistently earned him gold stars from Dr. Reynolds. "It's probably just too much coffee and not enough sleep," William had said that morning, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. "You know how crazy March gets with graduation planning and teacher evaluations." I was sitting at my piano when the call came at 10:47 a.m. Mrs. Davidson from the school office, her voice tight with controlled panic, told me that William had collapsed during a faculty meeting and had been rushed to Rosemere General Hospital. The words seemed to echo from very far away, as if she were speaking through water. "They're doing everything they can, Eleanor," she said gently. "David is already on his way to meet you there." The 20-minute drive to the hospital felt like hours. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I tried to process what was happening. William had eaten his usual breakfast of oatmeal and fresh berries. He'd kissed me goodbye and reminded me about our dinner plans with the Johnsons that evening. Everything had been completely normal, completely ordinary, until suddenly it wasn't. David was waiting in the emergency room lobby when I arrived, his face pale and drawn in a way I'd never seen before. He wrapped me in a fierce hug that told me everything I needed to know before Dr. Martinez emerged from behind the double doors with the devastating news. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Martinez said, his voice gentle but definitive. "Your husband suffered a massive cardiac event. We did everything possible, but the damage was too extensive. He passed peacefully at 11:15. The world tilted sideways. William was gone. My partner of 43 years, the man who had held my hand through every crisis and celebrated every joy, had simply vanished from existence while discussing spring sports schedules with his colleagues. One moment he was planning our evening, and the next he was a memory. David held me as I sobbed in that sterile hospital corridor, making soft shushing sounds like I had when he was small and frightened. "We'll get through this together, Mom," he whispered into my hair. "Dad wouldn't want us to fall apart. We'll take care of each other." The funeral, 3 days later, was standing room only. Current and former students, fellow teachers, parents, and community members filled every pew of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, with overflow crowds gathering on the front lawn. Story after story emerged about William's impact: the troubled student he'd mentored through graduation, the young teacher he'd supported through her first difficult year, the countless small kindnesses that had rippled through our community for decades. "Your husband changed my life," a young man in an Army uniform told me during the reception. "I was headed for serious trouble my junior year, and Principal Hartwell could have suspended me. Instead, he spent his lunch periods tutoring me in math and helping me see a different path. I'm a staff sergeant now because of him." Through my grief, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the man I'd been blessed to love and the legacy he'd left behind. But I also felt terrifyingly alone. For the first time in 4 decades, I was facing life without my anchor, my companion, my best friend. David was incredible during those first awful weeks. He handled all the funeral arrangements, managed the endless paperwork that follows a death, and somehow juggled his work responsibilities while checking on me multiple times daily. Victoria, whom I was still getting to know, proved to be a source of unexpected comfort and practical support. "I know I can't replace your family," she said one evening as she helped me sort through sympathy cards, "but I want you to know that you're not alone. David and I are here for whatever you need." She had taken charge of organizing meals from church members, fielding phone calls from well-meaning neighbors, and even helping me navigate the bewildering world of widows' benefits and insurance claims. When I felt overwhelmed by the stack of financial documents requiring my attention, Victoria patiently explained each form and helped me understand what needed immediate action versus what could wait. "You've been through enough trauma," she said, organizing the papers into neat piles. "Let us handle the administrative burden while you focus on healing." The house felt impossibly large and quiet without William's presence. Every corner held memories. His reading chair by the window, the coffee mug he'd used every morning for 15 years, the small pile of school supplies he'd been accumulating for next year's students. I found myself talking to empty rooms, updating him on my day as if he might respond from the kitchen or call down from his office upstairs. Sleep became elusive. I would lie awake in our king-sized bed, my body naturally gravitating toward the right side, while the left side remained cold and untouched. The silence was deafening. No gentle snoring, no rustling of pages as William read before sleep, no whispered, "Good night, my love," that had ended every day for 4 decades. 3 weeks after the funeral, David approached me with a conversation that would unknowingly set everything else in motion. "Mom, I've been thinking about your situation here," he said carefully, settling into William's old chair in our living room. "This house is so big for one person, and there are so many memories everywhere. Have you considered whether staying here is the healthiest choice for your recovery?" I looked around our familiar space, the family photos covering the mantelpiece, William's books still organized exactly as he'd left them, the piano where I'd taught hundreds of students over the years. The idea of leaving felt like abandoning William all over again. "This is our home, David," I said softly. "Yours too. All your childhood memories are here. I can't imagine being anywhere else." "I understand that," he replied, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "And I'm not suggesting you sell tomorrow. But maybe we should start thinking about practical considerations. The maintenance alone on this place is enormous, and you'll be managing everything by yourself now." Victoria, who had been quietly organizing photo albums in the corner, looked up with what seemed like genuine concern. "What David's saying makes sense, Mom Eleanor. We just want to make sure you're not overwhelming yourself. This house requires so much upkeep, and you've got enough to worry about without adding home repairs and yard work to your grief." They painted a picture of me rattling around in rooms too big for one person, struggling with a furnace I'd never learned to maintain, dealing with the stress of property taxes and utility bills that had always been William's responsibility. When they put it that way, their concern seemed both logical and loving. "You could find a lovely condo," Victoria suggested gently. "Something modern and manageable. Maybe in one of those senior communities with activities and built-in social connections. You wouldn't have to give up your independence. Just make life easier for yourself." The suggestion felt premature, but I appreciated their thoughtfulness. They were thinking ahead, trying to protect me from future difficulties. I was too grief-stricken to anticipate. The fact that they were already worrying about my practical needs seemed like evidence of how much they cared. "I'm not ready to make any major decisions yet," I told them honestly, "but I promise I'll think about what you've said. Maybe in a few months, when the shock wears off a bit." David nodded understandingly. "Of course, there's no rush at all. We just want you to know that whatever you decide, we're here to support you through it." Over the following weeks, they began spending more time at the house, ostensibly to help me adjust to widowhood, but also, I began to notice, to familiarize themselves with our routines and possessions. Victoria would ask thoughtful questions about family heirlooms, the history of various pieces of furniture, and which items held special sentimental value. "I want to make sure I understand what's important to you," she explained when I commented on her detailed questions. "If you do decide to downsize eventually, I want to help you prioritize what should come with you and what might be better suited for donation or storage." David had begun handling more of my financial affairs, taking over the bill paying that had overwhelmed me in those first weeks of grief. He was meticulous and organized, creating spreadsheets that tracked every expense and establishing automatic payments for utilities and insurance. "Dad would want me to make sure you're taken care of," he said when I thanked him for his help. This is the least I can do." But it was during one of these financial conversations that the first seed of their future requests was planted. David had been reviewing my accounts and investments, ostensibly to ensure everything was properly organized and accessible. "Mom, I had no idea Dad had been so conservative with your investments," he said, showing me statements I'd never really examined before. "You're sitting on a substantial amount in low-yield savings accounts when you could be earning so much more through strategic diversification." He explained how my money could work harder for me, generating additional income that would provide security in my later years. Victoria, who apparently had some background in financial planning through her family's business ventures, supported his observations with sophisticated-sounding advice about market trends and investment opportunities. "We're not suggesting anything risky," Victoria assured me, "just smarter positioning of assets you already have." David has been researching some excellent opportunities through his real estate connections, things that could significantly improve your long-term financial picture. The conversation felt caring and responsible, two adults looking out for an elderly widow who might not understand the complexities of modern financial management. They weren't asking for anything, just offering to help me make better decisions about my own money. What I didn't realize was that this gentle introduction to discussions about my finances, combined with their growing familiarity with my daily routines and possessions, was laying the groundwork for much larger conversations to come. The loving son and daughter-in-law, who seemed so concerned about my well-being, were actually conducting reconnaissance, gathering information that would prove invaluable when their true intentions eventually emerged. But in those early months of grief, when every day felt like an enormous challenge and their support seemed like the only thing keeping me afloat, I was simply grateful to have family who cared enough to worry about my future. I had no idea that my future was exactly what they were planning to control. 6 months after William's passing, David and Victoria announced their engagement with a celebration that should have filled me with joy, but instead introduced the first subtle warnings I was too grief-stricken to recognize. The proposal had happened during a romantic weekend getaway to the Hamptons, complete with a sunset beach setting and a ring that must have cost more than my car. "We wanted to wait until you were feeling stronger," David explained as they showed me the enormous diamond solitaire, "but we also realized that life is precious and uncertain. Dad's death taught us not to postpone happiness." Victoria's ring was stunning, a flawless 2-carat stone set in platinum that caught the light from every angle. When I complimented its beauty, she laughed in a way that seemed slightly forced. "David insisted on the best," she said, holding her hand out to admire the sparkle. "He said his mother deserved a daughter-in-law who represents the family well in social situations. Apparently the right engagement ring opens doors in the real estate world." Something about that comment struck me as odd. Since when had David cared about impressing clients with his fiancée's jewelry? The David I'd raised valued character over appearances, substance over status symbols. But grief has a way of making everything feel slightly surreal, so I dismissed my unease as a symptom of my own emotional instability. The wedding planning began immediately, and it quickly became clear that Victoria had very specific ideas about what their celebration should look like. Gone were any suggestions of the intimate ceremony I'd imagined, perhaps in our church with a reception in our garden, surrounded by the community that had supported us through William's death. "We're thinking the Grandview Country Club," Victoria announced during one of our planning sessions, spreading glossy brochures across my kitchen table. "They host the most elegant events in the region, and David's business associates expect a certain level of sophistication." The venue fees alone were staggering, more than William and I had spent on our entire wedding, including our modest honeymoon. When I gently asked about the cost, David waved away my concerns with an optimism that seemed uncharacteristic. "It's an investment in our future, Mom," he said confidently. "The connections Victoria's family brings, combined with the professional relationships I'll build at an event like this, will pay for itself within a year through increased business." Victoria nodded enthusiastically, pulling out her phone to show me photos from similar events. "My family has been members at Grandview for 20 years. Everyone who matters in this area attends weddings there. It's not just a party, It's a strategic networking opportunity. The guest list grew from the 100 people I'd expected to nearly 300, most of whom I didn't recognize. Victoria's family apparently moved in circles that included local politicians, successful business owners, and what she called influencers in various industries. David seemed dazzled by these connections, talking excitedly about potential business partnerships and investment opportunities that might emerge from their wedding reception. "Can you imagine having Senator Richardson's ear for real estate ventures?" he said one evening, his eyes bright with possibility. Victoria's father plays golf with him twice a month. One conversation at our wedding could change everything for my career. As the planning progressed, I began to feel increasingly peripheral to the process, despite being the groom's only family member. Victoria's mother, Patricia Ashford, took charge of most decisions with the efficiency of someone accustomed to organizing elaborate social events. When I offered to help with flowers or music selection, I was politely but firmly redirected to less visible tasks. "Eleanor, dear," Patricia said during one of our few direct conversations, "you've been through so much this year. Why don't you focus on something simple, like choosing favors for the reception tables? We've handled the major vendor selections through our established relationships." The favors, I discovered, were expected to cost nearly $2,000 for elegant crystal ornaments engraved with David and Victoria's names and wedding date. When I suggested more modest alternatives, Victoria looked genuinely distressed. "But Mom Eleanor," she said, using the affectionate name that always melted my resistance, "this is our one chance to make a perfect first impression as a married couple. These details matter in my family's social circle. People notice everything, and they remember." It was during these planning sessions that I first heard Victoria mention expectations about wedding gifts that made me deeply uncomfortable. She had apparently registered at stores I'd never heard of, requesting items with price points that seemed astronomical for basic household necessities. "The Williams family gave us the most gorgeous Waterford crystal collection," she reported after one bridal shower, displaying pieces that sparkled like small diamonds. "And the Hendersons contributed toward our honeymoon fund. They wrote a check for $5,000. When I expressed surprise at such generous amounts, Victoria seemed surprised by my reaction. "Well, these are successful people investing in relationships," she explained matter-of-factly. "David's going to be handling their real estate needs for decades to come. A wedding gift is really just good business sense when you think about it that way." The conversation that truly unsettled me came 3 weeks before the wedding, when David approached me about what he called family contribution expectations. We were sitting in my living room, surrounded by wedding planning materials, when he brought up the subject with obvious discomfort. "Mom, I hate to ask this, but Victoria's family has been incredibly generous with wedding expenses, and I'm feeling pressure to demonstrate that our family is equally invested in their future together." He explained that the Ashfords had covered the venue, catering, flowers, and photography without complaint, but that certain family traditions expected the groom's family to contribute substantially as well. When I asked for specifics, David's answer left me speechless. "They're expecting around $25,000, he said quickly, not meeting my eyes. "I know it sounds like a lot, but think of it as an investment in their marriage, in their future success. Victoria's father has already promised to bring David into some business deals that could be incredibly lucrative." $25,000 represented a significant portion of my savings, money William and I had carefully accumulated through decades of modest living and careful budgeting. The idea of spending such an amount on one day, however special, felt completely contrary to everything we'd believed about financial responsibility. "David," I said carefully, "that's more than your father and I spent on your entire college education. Are you certain this expectation is reasonable?" Victoria, who had been suspiciously quiet during this conversation, suddenly became animated and emotional. "I'm so sorry, Mom Eleanor," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "I never wanted you to feel pressured about money. My family just assumes everyone operates at the same financial level, and I've been trying to protect you from their expectations. Maybe we should scale everything back, have a simpler wedding that doesn't put this kind of strain on anyone. The guilt that washed over me was immediate and overwhelming. Here was this lovely young woman, trying to protect me from embarrassment, willing to sacrifice her dream wedding rather than burden her future mother-in-law. David looked equally distressed, caught between his mother's financial limitations and his fiancé's family expectations. "No," I heard myself saying before I'd fully considered the implications. "This is your wedding, and it should be everything you've dreamed of. Let me see what I can do about the family contribution." The relief on both their faces was palpable, but something in Victoria's expression, a flash of what looked almost like triumph, bothered me for reasons I couldn't articulate. Later that evening, alone in my bedroom, I stared at the financial statements David had been helping me organize and tried to calculate whether I could afford such a contribution without jeopardizing my own security. William's life insurance had provided some cushion, but not enough to make $25,000 feel comfortable. I would need to liquidate part of my retirement account, accepting early withdrawal penalties that would make the real cost even higher. But David was my only child, and this was presumably his only wedding. How could I let financial anxiety overshadow what should be one of the happiest occasions of his life? The wedding itself was everything Victoria had envisioned: elegant, sophisticated, and undeniably impressive. The Grandview Country Club was transformed into something magical, with elaborate floral arrangements, ambient lighting, and a level of service that made every guest feel pampered. Victoria looked stunning in her designer gown, David was handsome and confident in his custom tuxedo, and their joy seemed genuine and infectious. But as I sat at the family table, watching the celebration unfold around me, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The David I'd raised had always been uncomfortable with ostentatious displays of wealth, yet here he was moving effortlessly through a world of luxury and privilege as if he'd been born to it. The Victoria who had once admired the authentic soul of our modest home was now holding court among women whose jewelry alone could have funded several family vacations. Most troubling was the way they both seemed to have forgotten that this elegant affair had been partially funded by my retirement security. When guests complimented the beautiful reception, neither David nor Victoria mentioned my contribution. When business cards were exchanged and networking connections made, I felt invisible despite being the one who had helped make it all possible. During the father-daughter dance, I watched Patricia Ashford's satisfied expression as she surveyed the successful event her family had orchestrated. This was clearly their world, their type of celebration, their definition of what constituted an appropriate beginning for a successful marriage. I had been allowed to participate, but only as a supporting player in someone else's production. As the evening wound down and guests began departing with elegant parting gifts and satisfied expressions, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with David and Victoria. The wedding marked not just their union, but my subtle transformation from family matriarch to someone whose primary value lay in her ability to contribute financially to their vision of success. The woman who had liquidated part of her retirement to fund crystal favors and designer flowers had no idea that this wedding contribution was just the beginning. What felt like a generous gesture from a loving mother was actually the first successful test of how much financial pressure I could be convinced to accept in the name of family loyalty and love. The honeymoon phase of David and Victoria's marriage lasted exactly 3 months before the first emergency arose that would establish a pattern I was too trusting to recognize. They had returned from 2 weeks in Tuscany, glowing with happiness and full of stories about vineyard tours, cooking classes, and romantic dinners overlooking rolling hills. Their joy was infectious, and I felt genuine satisfaction knowing that my wedding contribution had helped launch such a beautiful beginning to their life together. But by November, the glow had dimmed considerably, replaced by stress lines around David's eyes, and an edge of anxiety in Victoria's voice whenever they visited. During one of our Sunday dinners, which had resumed as a monthly rather than weekly tradition due to their busy social calendar, they finally revealed the source of their tension. "Mom, we need to talk to you about something serious," David began, pushing his food around his plate instead of eating. We're facing an unexpected financial challenge, and we're hoping you might be able to help us navigate it. Victoria immediately reached across the table to squeeze my hand, her eyes filling with what appeared to be genuine tears of distress. "We're so embarrassed to even bring this up," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "After everything you already did for our wedding, asking for more feels absolutely terrible. But we don't know where else to turn." The story they told was compelling and seemed to justify their panic. Victoria's boutique business venture, which she had launched with great fanfare 6 months earlier, was struggling far more than anticipated. She had invested heavily in inventory for her high-end women's clothing store, banking on connections from her family's social circle to provide a steady customer base. "The problem is timing," Victoria explained, wiping her eyes with the tissue I'd offered. "My target customers are all traveling for the holidays, and the sales I was counting on for November and December just aren't materializing. I have $30,000 worth of designer merchandise sitting in my store, but no cash flow to cover my lease payments and operating expenses." David nodded grimly, clearly as worried as his wife. "The lease alone is $3,500 a month, and that doesn't include utilities, insurance, or the business loan payments for her initial inventory investment. If we can't cover December and January, she'll lose everything she's worked for." The amount they needed minus $12,000 to bridge them through the slow winter months seemed enormous to me, but modest compared to the sums they'd discussed during wedding planning. They presented detailed financial projections showing how the business would recover in spring, when their wealthy clientele returned from winter vacations and began shopping for the social season. "This isn't a gift we're asking for," David emphasized, spreading spreadsheets across my dining room table. "It's a short-term loan with a clear repayment plan. By March, the business will be profitable enough to pay you back with interest." Victoria added that her father had already declined to help, explaining that his hotels were experiencing their own seasonal cash flow challenges. Her mother's family trust was tied up in legal complications following her grandmother's death. Their bank had turned down a business loan application due to the boutique's short operating history. "You're literally our only option," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "I know how much you sacrificed for our wedding, and asking for more makes me feel sick. But if I lose this business, I'll never forgive myself for giving up so easily when we were this close to success." Sitting in my kitchen, watching these two young people I loved wrestle with what appeared to be a temporary but serious crisis, I felt the familiar tug of maternal instinct. David had never asked me for money before his marriage, and seeing him so worried about his wife's dreams felt like a legitimate reason to help if I possibly could. "Let me review my finances and see what's possible," I told them, already mentally calculating whether I could liquidate more retirement funds without completely compromising my own security. Their relief was overwhelming and seemed completely authentic. Victoria hugged me tightly, promising through tears that they would never forget my generosity and would pay me back ahead of schedule, if at all possible. David looked as if a crushing weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "You're saving our marriage," he said quietly. The stress of this was starting to affect everything between us. Victoria's been losing sleep, and I've been working overtime trying to figure out solutions that just don't exist. 3 days later, I transferred $12,000 from my retirement account to Victoria's business account, accepting the early withdrawal penalties as a necessary cost of helping my family through a crisis. The gratitude they expressed made the financial sacrifice feel worthwhile, and their detailed plans for recovery seemed reasonable and well thought out. For 2 months, everything appeared to be progressing exactly as they'd predicted. Victoria reported increased foot traffic in her store, successful sales events, and growing interest from potential customers who had discovered her boutique through word-of-mouth recommendations. David seemed happier and more relaxed, and their marriage appeared to have weathered the financial storm successfully. But by March, instead of the promised loan repayment, another crisis emerged that required immediate attention and additional financial intervention. "Mom, I feel terrible bringing this up when we haven't even repaid the boutique loan yet," David said during a tense phone conversation. but we're facing a tax situation that could destroy everything we've worked for." The explanation was complex and involved tax implications of Victoria's business losses that apparently created unexpected liabilities for their joint tax return. According to their accountant, they owed an additional $8,000 beyond what they'd planned for, and the penalties for late payment would compound daily if not addressed immediately. The accountant says this is a one-time adjustment because of how the business depreciation was calculated, Victoria explained when they visited later that week. "Next year will be completely straightforward, but right now we're facing a deadline that could result in liens against our property if we can't pay." Again, they had exhausted other options. Victoria's parents were dealing with their own tax complications related to hotel property assessments. David's real estate commissions had been lower than expected due to a slow winter market. Their credit cards were already carrying balances from business expenses that hadn't yet been reimbursed. "I hate that we're even asking," Victoria said, tears flowing freely. "You've already been so generous, and here we are again with our hands out like children who can't manage their own affairs. Maybe we should just accept bankruptcy and start over." The threat of bankruptcy terrified me more than the immediate financial request. David had worked so hard to build his reputation in real estate, and Victoria's family connections could be valuable for his long-term success. If they declared bankruptcy, wouldn't that destroy everything they'd invested in their professional futures? "How much time do we have to decide?" I asked, already knowing I would probably agree to help again, but wanting to feel like I was making a deliberate choice rather than responding to emergency pressure. "The payment is due by the end of this week," David said apologetically. "I know that doesn't give you much time to consider options, but the penalties start accumulating immediately after the deadline." Once again, I found myself liquidating retirement funds to solve their crisis, this time accepting even steeper penalties because of the previous withdrawal. The $8,000 represented another significant chunk of my financial security, but their distress seemed so genuine and their gratitude so heartfelt that I convinced myself this was what William would have wanted me to do. "Family takes care of family," I told myself, echoing words William had often used when making sacrifices for David's education or opportunities. But as spring turned to summer, I began noticing changes in their lifestyle that didn't align with the financial struggles they'd described. Victoria was wearing new jewelry and carrying designer handbags that certainly hadn't come from her boutique's inventory. David had purchased an expensive watch and upgraded his car to a luxury sedan that he claimed was necessary for impressing high-end real estate clients. When I gently asked about the boutique's recovery, Victoria's answers became vague and defensive. "It's a slow process," she said when I inquired about repayment timelines. "The fashion industry is unpredictable, and I'm learning that building a loyal customer base takes longer than anyone expects. But we're making progress, and I'm confident we'll be able to start repaying you soon." David supported her optimism but seemed uncomfortable when I asked specific questions about sales figures or profit margins. Their answers felt rehearsed, and I began to suspect that the boutique was performing far worse than they were admitting, or that their definition of recovery was very different from mine. By August, a third crisis emerged that would test the limits of my willingness to continue enabling what I was slowly beginning to recognize as a pattern rather than a series of unfortunate coincidences. "The boutique lease is up for renewal," Victoria announced during one of our increasingly strained conversations, "and the landlord is demanding 6 months' rent in advance because of our previous late payments. If we can't come up with $21,000 by next Friday, I'll lose the store and everything we've invested in building the business." This time, their request felt different, larger, more desperate, and accompanied by less detailed explanation about how they had found themselves in such dire circumstances. When I asked about the previous loans and when I might expect repayment, their responses were evasive and filled with promises about future success that seemed increasingly unrealistic. But I was already in too deep to consider letting them fail now. $20,000 in previous loans would be completely lost if Victoria's business collapsed, and their emotional manipulation had convinced me that family loyalty required continued support regardless of my growing doubts. The woman who wrote that third check had no idea she was funding a lifestyle rather than supporting a struggling business. She couldn't have imagined that her retirement security was being systematically dismantled by people who viewed her love as a renewable resource to be harvested whenever their wants exceeded their means. The request that would ultimately cost me my financial future arrived on a crisp October morning in 2022, 18 months after I had begun what I still believed was temporary assistance for David and Victoria's business challenges. I was tending to my small herb garden, one of the few activities that still brought me peace, when David's car pulled into my driveway with an urgency that immediately set my nerves on edge. Both David and Victoria emerged from the vehicle looking haggard and desperate in a way I had never seen before. Victoria's usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her hair uncombed and her eyes red-rimmed, as if she had been crying for hours. David's face was pale and drawn, and he moved with the defeated posture of someone carrying an impossible burden. "Mom, we need to talk," David said without his usual greeting, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Something catastrophic has happened, and we're facing a situation that could destroy everything we've worked for." They followed me into the kitchen, where I automatically began preparing tea, a ritual that had comforted us through previous crises but felt inadequate for whatever news they were about to share. Victoria slumped into a chair and put her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "The boutique is being sued," David began, his words coming out in a rush as if speaking quickly might somehow minimize their impact. "One of Victoria's customers was injured in the store 3 weeks ago, and now she's claiming negligence and demanding damages that could bankrupt us completely." The story they told was horrifying in its implications and seemingly impossible to have predicted or prevented. An elderly woman had tripped over what she claimed was a loose carpet edge near the fitting rooms, fracturing her hip and requiring extensive surgery and rehabilitation. Her family had hired an aggressive personal injury attorney who was seeking $150,000 in damages, plus punitive costs. "Our insurance company is refusing to cover the claim," Victoria said through her tears, finally looking up to meet my eyes. "They're saying the carpet was a pre-existing hazard that we should have addressed, and that our policy doesn't cover injuries resulting from neglected maintenance issues." David pulled out a thick folder of legal documents, spreading them across my kitchen table with shaking hands. The papers looked official and threatening, filled with legal terminology I couldn't begin to understand, but that clearly spelled out devastating financial consequences for their failure to respond appropriately. "Our lawyer says we have 2 options," David continued, his voice becoming increasingly strained. "We can fight the lawsuit, which could take years and cost us $50,000 in legal fees with no guarantee of winning, or we can settle out of court for $75,000 and put this nightmare behind us." Victoria looked up with an expression of absolute desperation. "Mom, Eleanor, I know we still owe you money from before, and asking for more makes me feel like the worst person in the world. But if we don't settle this lawsuit, we'll lose everything: the boutique, our house, David's real estate license, our entire future." The amount they needed was staggering, minus $75,000 to settle the lawsuit immediately, plus an additional $10,000 for legal fees and court costs. It represented nearly half of my remaining retirement savings, money that William and I had accumulated through decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice, specifically to ensure my security in old age. "I don't know if I can access that much money," I said honestly, my voice barely above a whisper. "That would require liquidating almost everything I have left." David's face crumpled as if I had struck him. "Mom, I understand how enormous this request is, and I hate myself for even asking. But we're talking about our entire lives being destroyed. If Victoria loses this lawsuit, they can garnish my real estate commissions for years. We could lose our house. Our credit will be ruined. Everything we've worked for will be gone." Victoria's sobs intensified, and she reached across the table to grasp my hands with surprising strength. "I keep thinking about what your husband would want," she said through her tears. "He loved David so much, and he always talked about family taking care of family. Would he want his son to lose everything over an accident that wasn't anyone's fault? The emotional manipulation was more intense than anything they had attempted before, but their distress seemed so genuine that I found myself wavering despite my financial fears. They painted a picture of David's real estate career being destroyed by garnished wages, of their home being foreclosed upon, of their marriage crumbling under the stress of financial ruin. "There has to be another way," I protested weakly. "What about your parents, Victoria? Surely they wouldn't let you face bankruptcy over something like this." Victoria's expression turned bitter. "My father says this is a consequence of my poor business decisions, and that bailing me out would only enable future irresponsibility. My mother agrees with him. They've basically disowned me over this situation." David nodded grimly. "Her family sees this as Victoria's failure, not a random accident. They're refusing to help because they think she should have carried better insurance, or maintained the store more carefully. They're treating this like a moral failing rather than a tragic accident." The isolation they described seemed cruel and heartless. What kind of family abandons their children during a crisis beyond their control? How could wealthy parents who had spent thousands on wedding celebrations refuse to help their daughter avoid financial ruin over an elderly customer's unfortunate accident? "You're the only family we have left who believes in us," Victoria said, her voice breaking with emotion. "The only person who understands that sometimes good people face impossible circumstances through no fault of their own." They left me with the legal documents to review, promising to return the next day for my decision but making it clear that time was running out. The settlement deadline was approaching rapidly, and delay would only result in higher costs and more devastating consequences. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom, surrounded by financial statements and legal papers, trying to calculate whether I could survive giving away another $85,000 from my already depleted savings. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. Such a withdrawal would leave me with barely enough to maintain my current lifestyle for more than a few years, assuming no major health crises or home repairs. But the alternative, watching David's career and marriage destroyed by a lawsuit, felt even more unbearable. I kept thinking about William's voice saying, quote, "Family takes care of family," and imagining his disappointment if I chose my own financial security over our son's future. The next morning, I called my bank and began the process of liquidating nearly all my remaining investments. The early withdrawal penalties were brutal, reducing the actual value of my savings even further, but David and Victoria's relief when I told them my decision seemed to justify the sacrifice. "Mom, you're literally saving our lives," David said, hugging me with an intensity that reminded me of his childhood. "We'll never forget this. We'll find a way to pay you back, even if it takes years." Victoria was crying again, but these tears seemed different, filled with gratitude rather than desperation. "You're the most generous, loving person I've ever known," she said. "I promise you won't regret this decision. Once this nightmare is behind us, we'll focus entirely on building a future that honors your sacrifice." The wire transfer took 3 days to complete, during which I experienced alternating waves of certainty and panic about my decision. Was I being a loving mother or a foolish old woman? Was this genuine crisis management or elaborate manipulation? The questions tormented me, but the transaction was already in motion. Within a week of the settlement payment, David and Victoria's demeanor changed dramatically. The desperate anxiety was replaced by obvious relief, and they began talking excitedly about their plans for rebuilding the boutique business with better insurance and improved safety measures. Their gratitude seemed heartfelt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. I had become not just a mother and mother-in-law, but a financial resource to be managed and cultivated. The woman who had just sacrificed her retirement security for her family's crisis had no idea that the lawsuit itself might have been far less catastrophic than they had claimed, or that the settlement amount could have been negotiated to a much lower figure with competent legal representation. But the damage was done. My savings were gone. My financial independence was compromised, and my future security now depended entirely on the goodwill and success of two people whose priorities were becoming increasingly difficult to understand or predict. The wake-up call that would finally force me to confront the reality of my situation came not through any dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small lies and inconsistencies that I could no longer ignore. By January 2023, 3 months after depleting nearly all my savings for the lawsuit settlement, I was living on a fixed income that barely covered my basic expenses, yet David and Victoria seemed to be thriving in ways that contradicted everything they had told me about their financial struggles. The first crack in their carefully constructed narrative appeared during an unexpected visit to my doctor's office. I had been experiencing persistent fatigue and occasional dizziness that I attributed to the stress of my financial worries. But Dr. Richardson was concerned enough to order comprehensive blood work and recommend some additional tests that my insurance wouldn't fully cover. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said gently after reviewing my test results, "your symptoms appear to be related to nutritional deficiencies and stress-related exhaustion. Are you eating regularly, getting adequate nutrition?" The question embarrassed me deeply. Since the lawsuit settlement, I had been surviving primarily on pasta, canned soup, and whatever marked-down produce I could find at the grocery store. Fresh fruits, quality proteins, and the organic foods I had enjoyed throughout my marriage were now luxuries I couldn't afford on my drastically reduced budget. "I've had to make some adjustments to my diet," I admitted, unable to meet his eyes. "Financial considerations." Dr. Richardson's expression grew concerned. "Eleanor, proper nutrition is essential for someone your age. Are you having difficulty affording groceries? There are senior assistance programs that might help." The idea of needing food assistance at my age, after a lifetime of financial stability, was humiliating beyond words. But as I sat in his office calculating whether I could afford the recommended supplements he was prescribing, I realized that my situation had become genuinely desperate without my fully acknowledging it. That evening, as I sat in my kitchen eating another dinner of instant ramen noodles, I received a call from David that would provide the first glimpse behind their facade of financial struggle. "Mom, great news," he said, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Victoria and I just put an offer on a vacation condo in Clearwater Beach. We found this amazing deal through one of my real estate connections, a foreclosure property that we can flip into a rental investment." I nearly dropped the phone. A vacation condo? Investment property? These were people who 3 months earlier had claimed to be facing bankruptcy and financial ruin, who had convinced me to sacrifice my retirement savings to save them from disaster. "David," I said carefully, "how are you able to afford an investment property when you were just facing a lawsuit that threatened to destroy everything you owned?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when David responded, his tone had shifted from excitement to defensive explanation. "Well, the lawsuit settlement actually freed up our cash flows significantly," he said, his words coming faster than usual. "And Victoria's boutique has been performing much better than expected since we resolved the insurance issues. Plus, this condo purchase is really more of a business investment than a personal expense." The explanation felt hollow and calculated, lacking the emotional authenticity that had characterized our previous conversations about their financial crises. When I pressed for more details about how their circumstances had improved so dramatically in such a short time, David became evasive and eventually cut the conversation short, claiming he had another call he needed to take. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to details I had previously overlooked or rationalized away. Victoria's social media posts, which I had started following to feel more connected to their lives, told a very different story than the one they had been sharing with me personally. Photos from expensive restaurants appeared regularly on her Instagram account, tagged with captions about celebrating success and, quote, grateful for abundance. Her wardrobe in these photos consisted entirely of designer clothing that would have cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Most telling were the images from weekend getaways to luxury resorts, complete with spa treatments and private dining experiences that contradicted every conversation we'd had about their need to budget carefully. When I mentioned seeing these posts during one of our phone conversations, Victoria's response was smooth but unconvincing. "Oh, Mom, Eleanor, those are mostly business expenses," she said with a light laugh. "The boutique is doing well enough now that I need to maintain a certain image for my clientele. And David's real estate business requires entertaining clients at upscale venues. It's all about making the right impression in our industry." But the explanation didn't account for the obvious joy and relaxation in their faces during these business outings, or the intimate romantic poses that suggested personal celebration rather than professional obligation. More disturbing was the realization that these expensive lifestyle choices were happening while I was rationing my medications to make them last longer, and had canceled my cable television to save $30 a month. The most devastating revelation came in March when I ran into Jennifer Walsh, a former student whose mother had been friends with Victoria's family for years. Jennifer had always been chatty and well-informed about local social circles, and she seemed eager to share news about David and Victoria's recent activities. "Mrs. Hartwell, you must be so proud of David and Victoria's success," she gushed as we encountered each other at the pharmacy. "My mother was just telling me about their beautiful new beach house, and how well Victoria's expanded boutique business is doing. She said Victoria's parents are thrilled that their investment in her business ventures has paid off so handsomely." I felt the blood drain from my face. Investment from her parents? The same parents who had supposedly disowned Victoria over the lawsuit and refused to help during her crisis? The same family who had forced her to turn to me as her only remaining option for financial support? "I think there might be some confusion," I said slowly, trying to process this information while maintaining my composure. "Victoria's parents refused to help her during some recent business difficulties." Jennifer looked genuinely puzzled. "Really? That's strange." "My mother was at their anniversary party last month, and Mrs. Ashford was bragging about how she and her husband had provided the seed money for Victoria's business expansion. She said they were planning to open a second boutique location with family funding." The conversation continued, but I barely heard the rest of Jennifer's enthusiastic chatter about David and Victoria's apparent success and social prominence. I felt dizzy and nauseated as the implications of what she had shared began to sink in. Victoria's parents hadn't abandoned her during the lawsuit crisis. They had presumably been supporting her business ventures all along, possibly even during the same time period when she was asking me for emergency assistance. That evening, I sat alone in my bedroom, surrounded by bank statements and financial records, trying to calculate exactly how much money I had given to David and Victoria over the past 2 years. The total was staggering: nearly $150,000 in wedding contributions, business loans, tax payments, and lawsuit settlements. Money that had come from my retirement savings, William's life insurance, and the financial security we had spent decades building together. Meanwhile, according to Jennifer's inadvertent revelation, Victoria had apparently had access to family money throughout the entire period when she was tearfully begging me for assistance to save her business and marriage. The desperate young woman who had sobbed in my kitchen about losing everything had been performing an elaborate deception designed to extract as much money as possible from her grief-stricken mother-in-law. For the first time since William's death, I felt truly angry rather than just hurt or confused. The anger was clean and energizing, cutting through the fog of guilt and family obligation that had clouded my judgment for so long. I had been systematically manipulated and financially exploited by people I loved and trusted. People who had taken advantage of my grief and isolation to fund their lifestyle choices. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls that would begin the process of reclaiming my agency and self-respect. The first was to my bank, requesting detailed records of all transactions related to David and Victoria over the past 2 years. The second was to Robert Martinez, William's former colleague who had become a financial advisor after retiring from education. "Eleanor," Robert said when I explained my situation, "what you're describing sounds like elder financial abuse. It's more common than people realize. and it often involves family members who exploit emotional relationships to gain access to savings and assets. His words hit me like a physical blow. Elder abuse. The term felt harsh and clinical, but it accurately described what had been happening to me. I wasn't just a generous mother who had helped her children through difficult times. I was a victim of deliberate financial manipulation by people who had systematically identified and exploited my vulnerabilities. "What should I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Document everything," Robert advised. "Get copies of all financial records, save any text messages or emails related to money requests, and start keeping a journal of conversations and incidents. Then we need to talk about protecting whatever assets you have left." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the woman who had been afraid to admit she needed food assistance had found the strength to acknowledge that she had been the victim of a crime. The wake-up call was brutal and humiliating, but it was also the beginning of my journey back to self-respect and financial independence. The final straw that would shatter my remaining illusions and force me into action came on a humid July evening in 2023. Exactly 2 years after I had begun what I thought was temporary assistance for David and Victoria's financial difficulties. I had been documenting their deceptions for 4 months, slowly building a case file that Robert Martinez had advised me to maintain, when an accidental discovery would expose the true depth of their betrayal in the most devastating way possible. The discovery happened because of technology I barely understood and had installed for entirely different reasons. 6 months earlier, after a minor fall in my bathroom that left me with a sprained wrist and considerable anxiety about living alone, David had insisted on installing a medical alert system throughout my house. The system included small monitoring devices in each room that could detect falls or calls for help, but also had an intercom feature that allowed two-way communication between rooms. "Mom, this will give us all peace of mind," David had said while supervising the installation. "If anything happens, you can call for help immediately, and Victoria and I can check on you remotely if we're worried." What I didn't fully understand was that one of these devices, installed in the guest bedroom that had become a storage room for baby items when David and Victoria visited with their infant daughter Emma, was actually recording conversations in that room and transmitting them to a receiver in my bedroom. The technology was supposed to be activated only during emergencies, but apparently had been malfunctioning intermittently, picking up and broadcasting random conversations. On that July evening, I was lying in bed reading when voices began coming through the receiver with startling clarity. At first, I thought the system was malfunctioning again and was about to call the service company when I realized the voices belonged to David and Victoria, who were visiting for Emma's bedtime routine. "God, I can't wait until this is all over," Victoria's voice said with a weariness I had never heard before. "Playing the grateful daughter-in-law is exhausting, and she's becoming more suspicious about our finances." David's response sent ice through my veins. "Just stick to the plan. We only need to keep this up for another year or 2 at most. Once she signs the will amendment transferring the house, we can start encouraging her to move into that assisted living facility. Then we'll have complete control of the asset." "What if she refuses to sign?" Victoria asked. "She's been asking more questions lately about when we're going to start repaying the loans. What if she realizes we never intended to pay her back?" David's laugh was cold and calculating, completely foreign from the son I thought I knew. "She's too emotionally dependent on us to refuse anything we ask. We're her only family, her only connection to normalcy. Besides, we've already established that she's becoming forgetful and possibly incompetent. If necessary, we can have her declared unable to manage her own affairs." The words hit me like physical blows. Will amendment? Transferring the house? Declaring me incompetent? I gripped the receiver with shaking hands, horrified, but unable to stop listening to this conversation that was revealing the systematic destruction of my life. "I still feel bad sometimes," Victoria continued, though her tone suggested mild guilt rather than genuine remorse. "She really believes we care about her, and she sacrificed so much thinking she was helping us through temporary problems." "Don't get sentimental now," David replied sharply. That money was just sitting in retirement accounts, earning minimal interest. We've put it to much better use through real estate investments and business ventures. In the long run, our success will benefit everyone, including her. Victoria's voice became more animated. Speaking of which, did your realtor friend confirm the property value estimates for her house? If it's really worth $400,000 like he thinks, we could sell it and use the proceeds to buy that rental property portfolio in Florida. The cash flow from those rentals would set us up for life. He's doing a formal appraisal next week, David answered. Once we have official documentation of the value, we can approach her about updating her will to reflect current market conditions. She trusts us completely with financial matters now. I felt nauseated as the full scope of their scheme became clear. They weren't just exploiting me for immediate cash. They were systematically positioning themselves to inherit everything I owned while simultaneously working to have me declared incompetent so I couldn't interfere with their plans. "What about Emma?" Victoria asked, her voice softening slightly. "Sometimes I wonder if we should be doing this differently, for her sake. What kind of example are we setting?" David's response was immediate and chilling. "Emma will thank us when she's older and has access to generational wealth that will fund her education and future. We're securing our family's financial future through strategic planning, not sitting around waiting for handouts or hoping for charity." "But your mother loves Emma so much," Victoria protested weakly. "She lights up whenever she sees her. Doesn't that count for something?" "Of course it does," David said, his tone becoming more manipulative. "And Emma loves her grandmother too. That's exactly why this arrangement works so well. Eleanor gets to feel useful and loved while we secure the resources necessary to provide Emma with the best possible life. Everyone benefits." The casual way they discussed my love for my granddaughter as a tool for manipulation was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire conversation. Emma's sweet hugs and innocent "I love you, Grandma Eleanor" had been one of the few pure joys remaining in my life, and now I understood that even those precious moments were being orchestrated and exploited. "How much longer do you think we can keep requesting emergency money?" Victoria asked. "She's definitely become more careful about her spending, and I'm worried she might start asking for documentation or want to see business records." David's confidence was unshaken. "We have at least 2 more major requests planned. The boutique expansion story should be good for another $30,000, and we can probably get $20,000 more for Emma's education fund if we time it right. After that, we transition to the assisted living narrative and focus on gaining legal control." "The assisted living places we looked at are really expensive," Victoria noted. "Won't she resist spending that much on herself?" "We'll frame it as a safety issue," David explained. "Her fall last year, the medical alert system, increasing frailty. It's all documented. We can make a compelling case that living alone is becoming dangerous for someone her age. Once she's in assisted living, we can sell the house to pay for her care." The cruelty of their planning was breathtaking. They had orchestrated my isolation, documented my vulnerabilities, and created a paper trail that would support their narrative of my declining competence. The fall that had prompted the medical alert system, the financial stress that had affected my health, even my increasing confusion about their contradictory stories, all of it could be presented as evidence that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. "I just hope she doesn't figure it out before we're ready," Victoria said with a nervousness that suggested she wasn't entirely confident in their plan. "Sometimes I catch her looking at us with this expression, like she's trying to solve a puzzle. What if she starts asking other people for advice?" "Who would she ask?" David responded dismissively. "She doesn't have close friends anymore since Dad died. Her sister lives in another state and barely stays in touch. We've been careful to position ourselves as her primary support system and information source." The accuracy of his assessment was devastating. They had correctly identified my isolation and vulnerability, systematically reinforcing my dependence on them while cutting off potential sources of outside perspective or support. My grief had made me an ideal target for their manipulation. "Besides," David continued, "even if she did suspect something, what could she do about it? She's already given us most of her liquid assets. The house is her only remaining valuable asset, and we're positioning ourselves to control that too. By the time she realizes what's happening, if she ever does, it will be too late to change anything. As their conversation moved on to other topics, I lay in my bed in complete shock, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the magnitude of what I had just learned. The son I had raised, the young man I had sacrificed everything to support through college and early adulthood, was systematically destroying my life for financial gain. The daughter-in-law I had welcomed into my heart, who called me Mom Eleanor and brought me flowers, was actively planning my institutionalization so they could steal my home. But perhaps the most devastating realization was that they were right about my vulnerability. I was isolated, financially depleted, and emotionally dependent on people who viewed me as nothing more than an asset to be liquidated. The loving family I thought I had been supporting didn't exist. It had been an elaborate performance designed to extract maximum value from my trust and generosity. As I finally turned off the receiver and lay in the darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced since William's death: absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. The woman who had been questioning her own memory and judgment now had irrefutable proof of the conspiracy against her. The victim, who had been making excuses for her abusers, now understood exactly how deliberate and calculated their actions had been. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of protecting myself and fighting back. But tonight, I grieved for the family I had thought I had, and began planning for the war one would need to wage to reclaim my life and dignity. The transformation from victim to strategist began at 6 a.m. the morning after I had overheard David and Victoria's devastating conversation. For the first time in 2 years, I woke up with a clear sense of purpose and the kind of focused energy I hadn't felt since William's death. The woman who had been questioning her own memory and judgment was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood exactly what she was fighting against. My first action was to secure the evidence. I spent an hour learning how to operate the recording function on the medical alert system, managing to capture the previous evening's conversation onto a digital file that I immediately backed up to 3 different locations. Robert Martinez had emphasized the importance of documentation, and this recording would provide irrefutable proof of David and Victoria's intentions and methods. Next, I began implementing the financial protection strategies Robert had outlined during our previous conversations. I drove to First National Bank at opening time and requested an immediate meeting with the branch manager, Janet Morrison, whom I had known professionally for over 15 years. "Eleanor," Janet said, her expression growing concerned as I explained my situation, "what you're describing is exactly the kind of elder financial abuse we've been trained to recognize and prevent. I'm so sorry this has happened to you, especially involving family members." Within 2 hours, I had changed all my banking passwords, removed David's authorized access to my accounts, and established new security protocols that would require in-person verification for any significant transactions. Janet also helped me open a new savings account at a different bank, where I transferred what remained of my accessible funds, approximately $23,000 that represented my entire financial cushion. "We're also going to flag your accounts for unusual activity," Janet explained as we completed the paperwork. "Any attempts to access your money or change account information will trigger immediate notifications to both you and our security department." The next stop was the law office of Patricia Sullivan, an elder law attorney Robert had recommended, who specialized in cases involving family financial abuse. Patricia's office was located in a restored Victorian house not far from downtown, and her warm but professional demeanor immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Hartwell," Patricia said after reviewing the documentation I had brought, including the recorded conversation, "you have an extremely strong case for financial elder abuse. More importantly, we need to take immediate action to protect you from further exploitation." Patricia explained that David and Victoria's scheme involved multiple criminal activities: financial exploitation, fraud through false pretenses, and conspiracy to commit guardianship abuse. The recorded conversation provided evidence of premeditation and ongoing criminal intent that could result in serious legal consequences for both of them. However, Patricia cautioned, pursuing criminal charges is a separate matter from protecting your remaining assets and ensuring your safety. Our immediate priority should be preventing them from executing their plan to have you declared incompetent or gaining control of your house. We spent the next 3 hours developing a comprehensive protection strategy. Patricia helped me draft a new will that explicitly excluded David and Victoria from any inheritance, instead leaving my estate to local charities and Emma's education fund, but only accessible when she reached adulthood and only if she maintained a relationship with me independent of her parents' influence. We're also going to create an advance directive and healthcare power of attorney designating someone other than David, Patricia explained. Do you have any trusted friends or family members who could serve in this capacity? The question highlighted just how successfully David and Victoria had isolated me from potential support systems. After William's death, I had allowed my friendships to lapse and had minimized contact with my sister Linda and other extended family members. My world had gradually shrunk to include only David, Victoria, and little Emma. I have a sister in Ohio, I said hesitantly. We haven't been close recently, but she's always been trustworthy and independent-minded. Patricia nodded approvingly. Distance can actually be an advantage in these situations. Someone outside the immediate area is less susceptible to manipulation or pressure from the perpetrators. That afternoon, I made one of the most difficult phone calls of my life. Linda answered on the second ring, and I could hear the surprise in her voice when she realized it was me calling in the middle of a weekday. "Eleanor, is everything all right? You sound strange." I took a deep breath and began explaining everything that had happened over the past 2 years. The financial requests, the mounting evidence of deception, and finally, the recorded conversation that had revealed the true scope of their betrayal. Linda listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of shock or sympathy. "Oh, honey," she said when I finished, her voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea things were that bad. Why didn't you call me sooner?" I was embarrassed, I admitted, and I thought I was helping them. I believed everything they told me about their financial problems. "Of course you did," Linda said firmly. "You're a loving mother and grandmother. You trusted people you had every reason to trust. This isn't your fault, Eleanor. This is criminal behavior." Linda immediately agreed to serve as my healthcare power of attorney and emergency contact, and we arranged for her to visit the following week to help me implement additional security measures. Her support felt like a lifeline after months of isolation and self-doubt. The most challenging aspect of my protection strategy involved maintaining the appearance of normalcy while secretly documenting David and Victoria's continued attempts to manipulate me. Patricia had advised me to avoid confronting them directly until we had gathered additional evidence and put all protective measures in place. "The recording you have is excellent evidence," she explained, "but courts like to see patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents. If you can document a few more examples of their deception while protecting yourself from further financial harm, it will strengthen our case significantly." This meant that when David called that evening to discuss their latest financial request, the boutique expansion story he had mentioned in the recorded conversation, I had to respond as if I were still the trusting, vulnerable woman they believed me to be. "Mom, I have some exciting news about Victoria's business," David began, his voice carrying the same enthusiastic tone that had once convinced me of his sincerity. "She's been offered an opportunity to open a second boutique location in a premium shopping district, but we need to move quickly to secure the lease." The performance was flawless, complete with detailed explanations about foot traffic patterns, target demographics, and projected profit margins. Victoria got on the phone to express her excitement and gratitude, her voice carrying just the right note of nervous hope that had always melted my resistance to their requests. "Mom, Eleanor, this could be the breakthrough we've been working toward," she said, her tone perfectly calibrated to suggest both vulnerability and opportunity. "But the landlord wants 3 months' rent in advance plus a security deposit. We're looking at about $30,000 total. Instead of immediately agreeing, as I had done so many times before, I forced myself to respond with the caution they would expect from someone whose financial resources had been depleted by previous emergencies. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," I said carefully, "but I'll need to review my finances before making any commitments. The lawsuit settlement and previous business loans have left me quite stretched." The slight pause in their responses told me they hadn't expected resistance, even mild resistance, to their latest request. David quickly pivoted to reassurance mode, emphasizing the short-term nature of the investment and their strong track record of business success. "Of course, Mom. We understand completely," he said smoothly. "Take all the time you need to consider it. We just wanted to share the opportunity with you first, since you've been such an incredible partner in Victoria's business journey." After ending the call, I immediately documented the conversation, noting the specific amounts requested, the timeline they had proposed, and the emotional manipulation techniques they had employed. The pattern Patricia had described was becoming clear. Each request built on previous successes while exploiting my emotional investment in their happiness and prosperity. Over the following week, I continued gathering evidence while implementing additional security measures. I installed new locks on my house, changed my phone number, and gave the new number only to trusted contacts like Linda and Patricia, and began carrying a small digital recorder to document any in-person conversations with David and Victoria. The most empowering aspect of this process was rediscovering my own competence and agency. For months, I had been accepting their assessment of my declining mental abilities and increasing dependency. But as I navigated complex legal procedures, managed detailed financial planning, and coordinated with multiple professionals, I realized that my cognitive abilities were perfectly intact. My confusion and uncertainty had been the natural result of trying to make sense of deliberately false information, not evidence of mental decline. By the end of the week, I had transformed from a vulnerable widow being systematically exploited by her family into a woman taking active control of her situation. The evidence against David and Victoria was mounting, my assets were protected, and I had assembled a support team of professionals who understood both the legal and emotional complexities of my situation. The woman who had once questioned whether she was being too suspicious or ungrateful now understood that her instincts had been warning her about real danger all along. The next phase of my plan would involve confronting David and Victoria with evidence of their deception and making it clear that their scheme had been discovered and neutralized. The confrontation I had been planning for 2 weeks arrived sooner than expected when David and Victoria showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning in early August, their faces showing a mixture of impatience and barely concealed frustration that I hadn't yet responded to their boutique expansion request. They had brought little Emma with them, clearly intending to use my love for my granddaughter as additional emotional leverage. "Mom, we need to talk about the timeline for the investment opportunity," David said without his usual warm greeting, settling into William's old chair with an air of authority that immediately set my nerves on edge. "The landlord is pressuring us for a decision, and we can't afford to lose this prime location." Victoria bounced Emma on her lap while adding her own pressure to the conversation. "Mom, Eleanor, I know you said you needed time to review your finances, but we've run the numbers from every angle. This expansion will triple our revenue within 6 months. We just need to move forward quickly." For the first time in 2 years, I was ready for their manipulation tactics. The small digital recorder in my cardigan pocket was capturing every word, and my newly installed security system was automatically backing up the conversation to cloud storage that Patricia Sullivan could access if needed. "Actually," I said calmly, reaching for the folder I had prepared for this moment, "I've done quite a bit of financial review lately, and I've discovered some interesting discrepancies that we need to discuss." I placed printouts of their social media posts on the coffee table between us, images of expensive vacations, luxury purchases, and lifestyle choices that contradicted every story they had told me about financial hardship. Victoria's face went pale as she recognized the photos, while David's expression shifted from impatience to alarm. "David," I continued, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart, "can you explain how you were able to afford a $40,000 vacation to Europe while supposedly facing bankruptcy over Victoria's lawsuit settlement?" "Mom, those photos are misleading," David said quickly, his practiced charm emerging as he attempted damage control. "That trip was paid for by Victoria's parents as a recovery gift after the stress of the lawsuit. We didn't spend our own money." "Interesting," I replied, pulling out additional documentation. "Because according to Jennifer Walsh, whose mother attended your recent anniversary party, Victoria's parents have been funding her business ventures throughout the entire period when she was asking me for emergency assistance." Victoria's grip tightened on Emma, and she began speaking rapidly, her voice taking on the desperate tone that had once moved me to immediate sympathy. "Mom, Eleanor, there's been some terrible misunderstanding. Jennifer's mother must have misheard something at the party. My parents specifically refused to help us during the lawsuit crisis. You know that." "Actually," I said, pulling out the final piece of evidence, "I know exactly what you both said about your parents' support, because I have it recorded." The silence that followed was deafening. David's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and calculation, before settling on a cold hardness I had never seen before. Victoria looked genuinely terrified, clutching Emma so tightly that the baby began to fuss. "You recorded us?" David asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "In our private conversations?" "In my house," I corrected firmly, "where you were discussing plans to have me declared incompetent, steal my home, and institutionalize me in expensive assisted living so you could liquidate my assets for real estate investments." I activated the playback function on my tablet, and their voices filled the room with devastating clarity. David discussing will amendments and property values. Victoria calculating how much more money they could extract before implementing their assisted living plan. Both of them casually discussing my emotional manipulation as a useful tool for maintaining control. As the recording played, Victoria began crying. But these weren't the practiced tears she had used to manipulate my sympathy. These were tears of panic and genuine fear as she realized the magnitude of their exposure. David sat frozen, his face a mask of barely controlled rage as he listened to his own voice revealing the criminal conspiracy he had orchestrated. When the recording ended, the silence stretched for nearly a minute before David exploded into defensive anger. "You had no right to spy on us? That's invasion of privacy. And even if we said some things that sound bad out of context, everything we did was for your own good." "For my own good?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "Stealing $150,000 from my retirement savings was for my own good? Planning to have me declared incompetent was for my own good? Systematically isolating me from potential support systems was for my own good?" Victoria attempted to regain control through emotional manipulation, bouncing Emma and speaking in the tearful voice that had once melted my resistance. "Mom, Eleanor, you're taking everything out of context. Yes, we made some mistakes in how we talked about things, but our love for you is real. Emma adores you, and you're such an important part of our family. Your love for me," I said quietly, "is conditional on my ability to provide financial support for your lifestyle choices. The moment I became unable to fund your wants, you began planning to institutionalize me and steal my home." David's anger was becoming more pronounced as he realized that his usual intimidation tactics weren't working. "Mom, you're being completely unreasonable. We've never stolen anything from you. Everything you gave us was voluntary, and we've always been grateful for your support." "Grateful enough to plan my institutionalization?" I asked, producing copies of the assisted living brochures I had found in Victoria's purse during a previous visit, along with the property appraisal David had commissioned without my knowledge. "Grateful enough to have my house secretly appraised so you could calculate its value for your rental property investments?" The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Victoria abandoned her emotional appeals and began pleading for forgiveness, promising that they would change their behavior and pay back every penny they had taken. David shifted to threats, warning me about the consequences of destroying our family and suggesting that my accusations could damage his real estate career and Emma's future security. "What about Emma's college fund?" Victoria asked desperately. "You've always said you wanted to provide for her education. If you pursue this legally, you'll be destroying her future opportunities." "Emma's education fund," I replied calmly, "is already established through my new will, but it will only be accessible to her directly when she turns 18, and only if she maintains an independent relationship with me that isn't controlled or monitored by her parents." David's face turned red with fury as the implications of my statement sank in. "You changed your will? You cut us out of your inheritance?" "I protected my assets from theft," I corrected. "Just as I've protected my bank accounts, established legal guardianship with my sister Linda, and documented your systematic financial abuse with law enforcement and elder advocacy organizations." The revelation that I had involved outside authorities sent both of them into panic mode. Victoria began sobbing uncontrollably while David paced the room like a caged animal, alternating between threats and desperate attempts at negotiation. "Mom, you don't understand what you're doing," David said, his voice taking on a menacing edge. "If you pursue this legally, it will destroy more than just our lives. The scandal will affect Emma's reputation when she's older. Is your pride really worth damaging your granddaughter's future?" "My granddaughter's future," I said firmly, "will be better served by not growing up with parents who believe that financial exploitation and emotional manipulation are acceptable ways to treat family members." As the confrontation continued, more details emerged about the full scope of their deception. Victoria finally admitted that her parents had indeed been supporting her business ventures throughout the period when she was claiming to face financial ruin. David acknowledged that the lawsuit settlement had been far less than they had claimed, and that most of the money I had provided had gone toward luxury purchases and investment properties rather than genuine emergencies. Most shocking was their admission that they had deliberately documented my supposed cognitive decline, photographing my house during periods when grief and stress had left me less attentive to housekeeping, recording conversations where I seemed confused or forgetful, and sharing these materials with an attorney who specialized in guardianship proceedings for elderly clients. "We were trying to protect you from yourself," Victoria claimed weakly. "You were making poor financial decisions and seemed increasingly unable to manage your affairs independently." "The poor financial decisions," I replied coldly, "were believing your lies and trusting people who viewed my love as a weakness to be exploited." By the time they left my house that afternoon, the relationship we had pretended to maintain was completely destroyed. But for the first time in 2 years, I felt genuine relief rather than grief about the end of these toxic connections. The people I was losing had never truly existed. They had been elaborate performances designed to extract maximum value from my emotional vulnerability and financial resources. That evening, I called Patricia Sullivan to report on the confrontation and provide her with the additional recordings I had captured. She was pleased with the evidence we had gathered, but warned me to expect escalation in their behavior as they realized the full consequences of their exposure. "Eleanor," she said seriously, "people who commit this type of financial abuse often become desperate and potentially dangerous when their schemes are discovered. I want you to be very careful about your personal security and consider staying with your sister or other trusted friends until we can resolve this legally." The woman who had once been afraid to admit she needed help with groceries was now someone who had exposed a criminal conspiracy and was preparing to testify against her own son in court. The transformation was complete, but the hardest battles were still ahead. The weeks following my confrontation with David and Victoria marked the beginning of what I could only describe as a renaissance in my life. After 2 years of shrinking my world to accommodate their manipulation and financial demands, I found myself rediscovering parts of my identity that had been dormant since William's death, while also exploring entirely new aspects of who I could become at 74 years old. My sister Linda arrived from Ohio 3 days after the confrontation, bringing with her a vitality and protective fierceness that reminded me of the girls we had been decades earlier. She had taken early retirement from her position as a school librarian, specifically to help me navigate the legal proceedings and emotional recovery ahead. "Eleanor," she said as we sat in my kitchen sharing coffee and homemade scones she had brought from her favorite bakery, "I should have been paying closer attention to what was happening. When you stopped calling regularly and seemed so focused on David and Victoria's problems, I assumed you were just processing grief in your own way." Linda's presence in my house transformed the atmosphere from one of isolation and anxiety to something approaching normalcy. She had a gift for creating comfort through small gestures: fresh flowers on the dining room table, classical music playing softly in the background, and the simple pleasure of conversation with someone who had no agenda beyond wanting to spend time together. "You know," Linda said one evening as we worked together to organize the guest room for her extended stay, "I've been thinking about something Mom used to say when we were teenagers and making poor choices about boyfriends." I smiled, remembering our mother's gentle but persistent wisdom during our adolescent years. "What did she say?" "She used to tell us that the people who truly love you will never make you choose between your self-respect and their affection. The ones who demand that kind of sacrifice aren't offering love, they're offering a transaction." The observation struck me with unexpected force. For 2 years, I had been unconsciously making exactly that choice, sacrificing my financial security, my judgment, and ultimately my self-respect to maintain what I believed was love from David and Victoria. The real love I was experiencing now, Linda's unconditional support, Patricia Sullivan's professional dedication, even the kindness of neighbors who had started checking on me more regularly, required no such sacrifices. One of those neighbors was Dr. James Brennan, a retired pediatrician who lived 2 houses down and had been widowed around the same time as me. We had exchanged polite greetings for years, but had never had substantive conversations until Linda encouraged me to accept his invitation to join him for evening walks around the neighborhood. "Eleanor," James said during one of our increasingly regular walks, "I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but you seem different lately. More present, if that makes sense, like you've come back to yourself after being away for a while." His observation was perceptive and accurate. The woman who had been questioning her own judgment and competence was gone, replaced by someone who was rediscovering her own voice and agency. The mental fog that I had attributed to aging and grief lifted as I realized it had been the natural result of trying to process deliberately false information and navigate relationships built on deception. "I've been dealing with some family difficulties," I told James, "and I'm finally starting to see clearly again." James nodded with understanding. Family relationships can be the most wonderful and the most damaging influences in our lives, sometimes simultaneously. I'm glad you're finding your way back to clarity. Our walks became a highlight of my days, providing both gentle exercise and stimulating conversation with someone who appreciated my thoughts without trying to influence or manipulate them. James had spent his career advocating for children in difficult situations, and his perspective on family dynamics was both professional and compassionate. "The hardest lesson I learned in pediatrics," he shared during one memorable evening walk, "was that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their destructive behavior, even when that person is your own child." The validation of my decision to cut off financial support to David and Victoria came from an unexpected source when I reconnected with my former piano students through social media. Several of them had heard about my situation through the small-town network that still connected many Rosemere Valley families, and they reached out to offer support and share their own experiences with difficult family relationships. "Mrs. Hartwell," wrote Sarah Chen, who had been one of my most dedicated students 15 years earlier, "I wanted you to know that the lessons you taught me about self-worth and standing up for myself probably saved my marriage. When my husband's gambling addiction started affecting our finances, I remembered you telling me that real love doesn't require you to sacrifice your own well-being for someone else's wants." These messages reminded me that my influence had extended far beyond my own family, that the values William and I had tried to model about respect, integrity, and healthy boundaries had resonated with hundreds of students over the decades. The woman who had been questioning her own judgment was rediscovering evidence of her lifelong commitment to helping others develop strength and self-respect. Perhaps the most unexpected development in my new life was the opportunity to help other elderly people facing similar exploitation. Patricia Sullivan introduced me to Margaret Foster, the director of the Regional Elder Advocacy Center, who asked if I would be willing to share my story as part of their education and prevention programs. Eleanor, Margaret explained during our first meeting, your case illustrates so many of the warning signs and manipulation tactics that families often miss until it's too late. Your willingness to speak publicly about financial elder abuse could help protect other people from similar situations. The idea of public speaking about such personal and painful experiences initially terrified me, but Margaret's suggestion that my story could serve as both warning and inspiration gradually won me over. My first presentation was to a small group of seniors at the community center, and I was amazed by the response. My daughter has been asking me to co-sign loans for her business, one woman shared after my presentation. I've been feeling guilty about hesitating, but after hearing your story, I realized my instincts were trying to protect me. Another participant, an elderly man whose son had been pressuring him to invest in cryptocurrency schemes, thanked me for helping him understand that his confusion about his son's financial requests wasn't a sign of cognitive decline, but rather evidence that the requests themselves didn't make logical sense. The community center presentations led to invitations to speak at other venues, senior living facilities, church groups, and even professional conferences for social workers and financial advisors. Each time I shared my story, I felt stronger and more confident in my recovery from the exploitation I had endured. Linda attended several of these presentations and was amazed by the transformation she witnessed. Eleanor, she said after watching me address a group of 50 people at the Regional Senior Center, you've found your calling. You're not just surviving what happened to you. You're using it to help other people. The speaking engagements also connected me with other survivors of financial elder abuse, creating a network of mutual support and shared wisdom that enriched my life in ways I had never anticipated. These were people who understood the unique shame and confusion that comes with being exploited by family members, who could validate the conflicted emotions of loving someone while recognizing their harmful behavior. Through these new relationships and activities, I began to see my experience with David and Victoria not as a devastating failure of judgment, but as a difficult education that had prepared me to help others avoid similar exploitation. The money I had lost couldn't be recovered, but the wisdom I had gained through surviving their manipulation was becoming valuable to countless other people facing similar challenges. 6 months after the confrontation that had ended my relationship with David and Victoria, I was living a life that was fuller and more purposeful than anything I had experienced since William's death. The isolation and dependency that had made me vulnerable to their exploitation had been replaced by genuine connections with people who valued my company, respected my boundaries, and appreciated my contributions to their lives. The woman who had once been afraid to admit she needed help buying groceries was now confidently advocating for policy changes to protect elderly people from financial abuse, building meaningful friendships with people who shared her values, and discovering that life at 74 could hold possibilities she had never imagined. 1 year after that fateful evening, when the baby monitor revealed David and Victoria's true intentions, I stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Elder Rights, preparing to deliver the keynote address about financial abuse prevention. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had once been too embarrassed to admit she needed help affording groceries was now considered an expert on protecting elderly people from exploitation. The legal proceedings against David and Victoria had concluded 6 months earlier with a settlement that required them to repay $75,000 of the money they had stolen from me, along with court costs and restitution fees. More importantly, they had both pled guilty to felony charges of financial elder abuse, which would remain on their permanent records and affect David's real estate license permanently. The hardest part, I had told Patricia Sullivan during our final meeting, isn't the money I lost or even the betrayal itself. It's grieving for the family I thought I had while simultaneously celebrating my freedom from the family that actually existed. Patricia had nodded with the understanding that comes from representing many clients in similar situations. Eleanor, what you've accomplished in this past year, protecting yourself, seeking justice, and then using your experience to help others, represents one of the most complete recoveries I've ever witnessed in an elder abuse case. The audience before me now included social workers, attorneys, healthcare professionals, and family members of elder abuse victims. As I looked out at their expectant faces, I felt the same sense of purpose that had sustained me through the most difficult period of my life. When I first realized that my son and daughter-in-law were systematically stealing my retirement savings, I began, my voice strong and clear. My instinct was to blame myself for being gullible, naive, and emotionally weak. It took me months to understand that their success in manipulating me wasn't evidence of my failings. It was evidence of their skill in exploiting the very qualities that make us human: love, trust, and the desire to help our family members succeed. I shared the specific tactics David and Victoria had used: the gradual escalation of requests, the emotional manipulation through false crises, the systematic isolation from potential sources of outside perspective, and the deliberate documentation of my supposed cognitive decline. But I also emphasized the warning signs I had ignored, and the internal voice that had tried to warn me when something didn't feel right. The most valuable lesson I learned, I continued, is that our intuition is usually correct when relationships feel unbalanced, or when love seems to come with increasingly expensive price tags. Trust your instincts, even when, especially when, the people you're doubting are family members you love. After my presentation, I was approached by dozens of people sharing their own stories or seeking advice about suspicious situations involving their elderly parents or grandparents. Each conversation reminded me of why this work had become so important to me, and how my painful experience was being transformed into something genuinely helpful for others. Among the people who approached me was Emma, now 3 years old, and accompanied by a court-appointed guardian. The custody arrangement that had emerged from the legal proceedings allowed me supervised visits with my granddaughter, though David and Victoria maintained primary custody under strict conditions that prohibited any attempts to manipulate me financially. "Grandma Eleanor!" Emma called out, running toward me with the unreserved joy that only small children possess. Her presence still brought me immense happiness, though it was now complicated by the knowledge of how her parents had used my love for her as a weapon against me. The guardian, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, explained that Emma often asked about me and had been excited about this visit for weeks. "She talks about the piano lessons you've been giving her, and the stories you tell about her grandfather William," Mrs. Patterson said. "It's clear that your relationship with her is genuine and important to her development." As Emma and I spent an hour together in the conference center's children's area, I marveled at her resilience and innocence. She had no knowledge of the conflict between her parents and me, no understanding of the legal proceedings that had determined her living arrangements, no awareness that our visits were monitored and limited by court order. "Will you play piano for me today?" she asked, her small hand in mine as we walked toward the practice room I had reserved. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, lifting her onto the piano bench beside me. "What would you like to hear?" As I played simple melodies and watched Emma's face light up with delight, I felt a profound sense of peace about the choices I had made. Protecting myself from further exploitation had also protected her from growing up with parents who viewed family relationships as opportunities for financial gain. The legal boundaries that limited my contact with her also ensured that any relationship we built would be based on genuine affection rather than manipulation or control. 6 months after the conference, I received news that would bring my journey full circle in an unexpected way. James Brennan, who had become my closest companion and romantic partner, proposed marriage during one of our evening walks through the neighborhood where we had both lived for decades. "Eleanor," he said, stopping beside the rose garden where William and I used to walk during our early years of marriage, "I know we're both at an age where people might think romance is behind us, but being with you has reminded me that love doesn't expire, it just deepens and becomes more precious." The proposal was perfect in its simplicity and authenticity. Everything my relationship with William had been, and everything my interactions with David and Victoria had never been. James's love came without conditions, financial expectations, or hidden agendas. He valued my company, respected my independence, and supported my advocacy work without trying to direct or control it. Our wedding 6 months later was a small celebration attended by Linda, several former piano students, colleagues from my advocacy work, and neighbors who had become genuine friends. The ceremony took place in my backyard garden, surrounded by the roses William had planted, and the memories of a lifetime spent in the house that had almost been stolen from me. "Today," I said during my wedding toast, looking at the faces of people who had supported me through the most difficult period of my life, "I'm not just marrying a wonderful man. I'm celebrating the discovery that it's never too late to rebuild your life on a foundation of authentic relationships and genuine respect." As James and I settled into married life, I continued my advocacy work with increased energy and focus. We traveled together to conferences across the country, and I published a book about financial elder abuse that became required reading in social work programs at several universities. The royalties from the book, combined with careful management of my remaining savings and James's pension, provided us with comfortable financial security that no one could threaten or manipulate. The most satisfying aspect of our new life together was the way we balanced independence with companionship. James respected my need for autonomy and decision-making authority, while I appreciated his partnership without feeling controlled or managed. Our relationship was built on the mutual respect and genuine affection that had been completely absent from my interactions with David and Victoria. 5 years after the baby monitor revealed the conspiracy against me, I can honestly say that losing nearly everything to financial abuse led me to gain something far more valuable: the knowledge of my own strength, the ability to distinguish between genuine love and manipulative performance, and the purpose that comes from using painful experiences to help protect others. The house that William and I built together remains my sanctuary, but it's no longer a place of isolation and vulnerability. It's filled with the laughter of friends, the warmth of genuine family relationships, and the satisfaction that comes from work that matters. Emma visits regularly now, and our relationship continues to grow deeper as she develops her own sense of independence and critical thinking. Most importantly, I learned that surviving betrayal by the people you love most doesn't diminish your capacity for trust and connection. It simply makes you wiser about where to invest those precious emotions. The woman who was once afraid to question suspicious financial requests is now someone who teaches others to trust their instincts and protect their dignity. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to walk away from relationships that diminish us, even when those relationships involve people we love. Sometimes the family we choose proves more loyal and loving than the family we're born into. And sometimes the most devastating losses lead us to discover strengths and possibilities we never knew we possessed. The baby monitor that accidentally captured David and Victoria's betrayal didn't just expose their scheme. It revealed the truth about my own resilience and the authentic love that was waiting for me once I stopped accepting substitutes. That truth, more than any material wealth they stole from me, is the legacy I'm most proud to share. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.